Hey everybody, welcome to the live stream for the 2017 edition of the State of JavaScript survey. I'm your host, Sasha Grief, and I'm joined today by my co-host and friend, Martin Heidegger.
Hello.
So we're both here in Japan. I'm in Kyoto, Martin is in Osaka. And today we'll have an awesome selection of guests. Local Japanese breakfast. Yeah, I just have tea. It's not even Japanese tea; it's Earl Grey. So yeah, I thought I would start with a brief introduction of the project, the state of JavaScript, how did it get started, who's doing it, and so on. So I'm gonna try and see if I can share my screen here. And yeah, so this is the survey results site. So the survey results are live, and you can check them out. So this actually got started last year. Last year's results are available at 2016.stateofjs.com. And I did it because I felt kind of lost in the JavaScript world myself, you know. There were a lot of options, a lot of libraries, and I knew other people felt the same way. So I figured a survey could be a good way to not only figure out what's popular, because that can be a bit misleading, but also what's actually what people actually enjoy using and would use again. So that was the thinking behind the would use again questions that are in the survey. So every library, we ask you not only if you like it, but if you would be willing to use it again. Because obviously, if you're using a library XYZ just because your boss asked you to, and you actually hate it, that's not a very good indicator. So we've reused the same format for this year. But one big difference, actually in the behind the scenes part of things, is that I'm not doing it by myself anymore. I was joined by two other also local developers here in Japan, Raphael Benit and Michael Rambo. So Raphael is the guy behind Nevo. This is a really cool React and D3 visualization library, probably the best I've seen so far. And we're using it, of course, for the visualization in the survey results. And then Michael, he's the creator of StateOfJS, which is a really, really awesome project. Basically a directory of all the JavaScript libraries available, or almost, organized by tags. You can see which one are most popular. That's actually very useful because you can see how specific library's popularity evolves over time. And we are actually using StateOfJS to give you these little pop-ups or tooltips that give you more background info on each library featured in the survey. And then, yeah, myself. So this is the three of us. And that's about all you need to know, I think, about the survey, really. So we had over 23,000 developers take the survey, which is really awesome. And it makes for a lot of great data to exploit and present to all you guys. But enough about me. Maybe Martin, you can talk a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and so on.
Hey, hello. So yeah, as Sasha kindly mentioned, my name is Martin Heidegger. I'm from Austria, living in Japan for quite a while now, 7 years or so. I'm a freelance developer right now, but also a community person, which means I organize various community events, not just GS, but also for foreigners living in Japan or design-related events. I have been working on quite a few JavaScript projects, and actually last year ended for me on a low note. I mean, probably it ended for a lot of people on a low note, but I left Node School, which I organized for like 2 years, because of personal issues and just exhaustion, mostly, because it's really a lot of work to coordinate people.
What was it? JavaScript fatigue?
It was not JavaScript fatigue, not at all. It was more like trying to organize several thousand people over all time zones and living in Japan with a family. That just doesn't work out. So I left on a low note. I then focused more on internationalization and internationalization libraries. I wrote my own one. I left Node School. Yeah, I wrote some Medium posts about it. I will share it in a chat later.
Yeah, I think, just speaking for myself, like burnout is a really common whenever you're involved in like open source or any volunteer kind of work, because there's no monetary reward, and so you really have to find your own motivation and do it for not do it expecting a reward really, but do it because you enjoy it. And even then, at some point, everybody has their breaking point, and you always need to take a break so you can kind of recharge and come back at it later, maybe.
Yes, but it's also kind of maturing. You get older, you learn to respect your limits. I think I was much more productive in my 20s, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially with family life.
Yes.
A lot of the time, I think you want to go to the same rhythm, the same speed, like all your life, but it's good to slow down a bit, I think.
Yeah. But after that, so I've worked on a few projects for myself mostly, which I found interesting. Some like related to internationalization or general workflows. None of them have had a major impact, and I actually kind of wanted to focus on doing my own stuff, just like thinking about what I want to do. And I professionally, I was first time paid for professional open source work. Like getting a project, fix that open source project. Yes, nice. So I've been working on Pottery. That's a 3D point cloud visualization library for a while. And that was really fun. And it looks like I'm going to get paid again. So no, but I have time to focus on Pottery again. So a bit more front end for me. I've done quite a bit of back end in the past years. And now I jump back into this in this whole framework discussion. I'm a fan of Browserify. I used to be a fan for a very long time. What Substack made, I'm not commenting on the code quality of how it's written, but on the usefulness of it. And wow, just Browserify has so many nice concepts in it. And when I had to introduce this to a developer that never saw, heard of Babel, React, Webpack, or anything, he was really pissed. Like this person, he was writing vanilla JavaScript for the better part of the last 4 or 5 years, and I tried to Browserify his project, get it on NPM and stuff like that, and he didn't enjoy the debugging processes, and I thought we have things to be better at, and that's why I joined here. The end of the year left on a high note. I, like every year, joined the NodeFest. That's the biggest Node or JavaScript, I'm not sure JavaScript event, but at least Node event in Tokyo.
Oh, by the way, I can't see your video anymore. I don't know if it's just me or there's something on your side.
My video
anyway,
is here. It's
not a big deal.
Doesn't. Oh, they see it. So it's just you.
Okay, maybe just me. Okay.
I went to NodeFest. We had a great time at NodeFest. Everybody who lives in Tokyo or in Asia should really come visit. we had like 26 speakers, of which 21 were foreign. So we flew them in, and Miles Bornis and from the Node team, and Franziska Hinkelmann from the V8 team were there, and lots of other really amazing peeps. And yeah, it's my serial personal connection to abroad, since I don't have much time to travel these days. But it was really awesome. And now that I get to do more, open source JavaScript for the next half year or so, I'm looking forward to do more.
Yeah, I think, we live in Japan. A lot of the people watching might, not live in New York or San Francisco or any big developer hub. So I think it's good to have these regular like events you can attend, or local communities, or when you're a freelancer, when you're an independent developer, I think a lot of us tend to get kind of stuck in our own little bubble and get very isolated. And I, for myself, I feel I have to almost not force, but make myself, step out and go to events, organize events, as we both do. And I should actually join more conferences. That's something I don't do as much. I did go to a Nordic JS this year, which was really cool in Stockholm. And that was a great experience. And I met some awesome people, from all over the JavaScript world, basically. So yeah, if you're in the chat, if you're watching this and you're feeling like a bit all alone in your own little corner of the JavaScript world, you have to remember that there's always like events and meetups you can go attend.
Yeah, totally. And if not, make one. I mean, JavaScript is such an universal language these days. Like, everybody knows it. And at the very least, you can make like hate on JS event, where just people can rant. And like once you have like 1 hour of JavaScript rant out of your system, you're feeling a lot better. And
okay, so we have a couple more minutes in your before the next guest. So I thought you could maybe answer a question. So we have a question here on ES proposal class fields. So ES proposal class fields, I thought you might have things to say about it. I haven't. I'm not following any of the ES whatever debates, but
yes,
I know you do. So.
I did follow the ES debates, particularly around what was it? Node.js interoperability, right? And I'm not a fan of classes. I've never been. I've worked for a very long time in ActionScript 3, and we had lots of classes. And I feel like it adds to this whole pre-processing step problem. Node.js 8, recently released, is in a much tighter schedule with the V8 team, so we get all the new ES features very quickly in the Node.js environment, and hopefully in the browser as well. But classes and fields for those, they have not been a good experience in ActionScript 3. So at the end of ActionScript 3, I was kind of like doing everything functional already, and then I switched to JavaScript and was like, yay, everything. Why do we need types again? So I'm not a good person to talk to about classes, but sure, once we have as we already have classes in JavaScript, what's there to stop it from being more cluttered and more complex?
Well, I think generally it seems clear that there's a trend towards functional programming in JavaScript. And so classes is kind of go in a different direction. I mean, in React, I think you can have both, actually. In some cases, classes are kind of easier or the right tool for the job. But generally, you do stick to like functional components and like functional programming patterns. So yeah, I probably feel the same way. Like I don't have a strong opinion. I think if some people, I think if you want to argue that it's better to have more tools, I can understand that. But as the general trend, like your default approach, I think that will go more towards functional programming.
And for many people, classes and the introspection properties of types has been their only way how they feel safe when they're doing developing, and their only way how introspection works in their mind. And I'm always sad to see the state of integration of NPM in tooling. So you know, like NPM is such a vast field of knowledge that is hidden to everyone. And if, for example, you could just require any library and it would automatically install it or give you introspection hints in your UI tooling, and then you would have automated code completion on whatever the tool spit out. That'd be much more useful than just a typing system, because then you have access on everything. You know, like your own types, sure, they're important, but all the knowledge out there is much more worth focusing on, in my opinion. That being said, yeah, we will surely get that. The ES team has rarely rejected a proposal recently. They have worked very hard on trying to get things right, but mostly they have just fixed the proposals towards a state where they think it's nice. And I'm pretty sure we will get that sooner or later. A good indicator for new ECMAScript properties to land in the JavaScript world is if the V8 implements it. So if you're interested in what comes, just look at the V8 bug tracker.
Okay, so now I'm waiting for our next guest. What I hadn't thought about is I actually have to invite them on screen, and there's a list of like 130 people. So I'm just scrolling to the usernames, trying to find the right one. Okay, so Jan, where are you? Almost got it. Oh, okay. No, wait, moved. That's the live events, especially since this is the first time we're doing it. It's kind of, we'll have these small, small downtimes between guests, probably as I get my stuff sorted out. Yeah. But okay, so while I'm inviting Jan and waiting for her to show up, let me answer a couple questions. So can we see salaries by country? Can we see salaries by country? This is something I wanted to do, but we didn't have time to implement it because it added a lot of data to the JSON file that we're loading. So we didn't quite have time to do it in a scalable way, but we do want to do it eventually. So stay tuned. We'll probably try to do a second release of the results where we fill in missing pieces, and we'll let you know by email. So,
hey.
Hey, Jan.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, this is a conference room called Velodrome.
Answer.
Someone just is like, yay, bikes.
Yeah, so you did the analysis for last year's survey results for the build tools section. So last year we didn't have as much data, so I thought we could have different experts provide their own analysis on each section. And this year, obviously, we have a lot more data, so I thought it would be a bit too much content. So we didn't have these analysis, but instead we have you live here, so it's probably even better. So I'll let you just introduce yourself for starters.
Okay, sure. My name's Jennifer Wong. I am currently a software engineer at Eventbrite. I've been here about 2.5 years. So essentially, I'm working mostly on the front end. I work on our front end platform team as of about 3 or 4 months ago. So it's a new team for me. It's been pretty interesting in terms of a changeover of tools for us at Eventbrite. And I really enjoy speaking at conferences, since you guys were talking about conferences as well.
Oh, so you just mentioned a change of tools. So can you talk about that
Sure.
a little bit?
So at Eventbrite, mostly what we had been using as a framework was Backbone when I had started, and with the help of Marionette on the view layer. So that's how we started out, at least in terms of at Eventbrite. We also did our kind of an interesting homegrown implementation of Flux and that pattern as well. I can't say it was like very long lasting though. So right now, what we had decided to do was to have a component library that was created by our designers. So it was a design system so that we could have more consistency in design at Eventbrite. And what we wanted to do is have that all built out in React. So we now have components, at least in our new design and rebranding of Eventbrite, built out in React, and that's usable across all of our feature teams. And most of those components were created by the front-end platform team before I was there. So I used to be on a feature team, and so I was one of the teams that was kind of consuming those components. And so with the change to our design system in React, we have gone over to the React world. We're using Redux. We've just switched over to a new dependency system, and we're using Webpack for that. We actually have one of our engineers as a core contributor to Yarn. So we're using Yarn. And just because we're like kind of changing over everything, we're like, let's use all the new things. So we're using Just for testing. And it's been really interesting actually for us because we've done such a huge switch, but it's got to be kind of slow because our organization is pretty big. And so we're still kind of, a lot of teams are still using Backbone and Marionette, and there's just a lot of legacy code that we're hoping to either slowly kind of move over or just completely replace at this point.
So did you guys consider other options beside React, or was it kind of like an obvious choice, or was there like an internal debate about
so
that?
I think the benefit of having a front-end platform team is you get to kind of make the decisions that you want to. So I think, I mean, I can't say exactly because I wasn't on the team yet, but it seemed like there was maybe some internal research done by the team before they had decided. And then I think essentially what happened was they decided on React, and everyone was like, okay, well, you know, that's the front end platform team. So we kind of, we just generally follow suit with the assumption that these are our front end experts on this team.
And did you, like, what were the major pain points, like, doing the switch? Were there anything like, I don't know, maybe routing or anything specific?
Actually, so since I'm thinking from the perspective of the feature team, most of the pain points were that with a new tool, we don't, you know, have as much background. Like many of us were coming at it from as beginners. And so just like learning a whole new framework and trying to build that from the ground up was pretty interesting. Also with our design system, it kind of lives off in its own repo, and incorporating components is really helpful because everything's built out for you. It's just you need to customize things. But at the same time, with those components, and they haven't necessarily been tested in a real app or a real application. And so once you kind of plug those things into a real application, that it can cause problems. And like, so I know we're going to have Marcy Sutton on pretty soon at some point, but like
Yeah,
it's kind of a similar issue with accessibility. Like you could have a standalone component and that component can be accessible, but once you put it into the user flow, it might not be accessible anymore.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, so because I have a lot of friends who are actually into what they call component-driven development, and in fact, we have a question right now from Michael Shulman. He's asking, did you use Storybook or something like that to manage your design system? So yeah, I would love your answer.
Actually, I don't know what Storybook is. So I don't know if you want to talk really briefly about what Storybook is, or if somebody wants to just like mention in the chat.
Well, he's the Storybook maintainer, and he's the next guest. So
okay.
I'll let him answer. But yeah, it's basically a tool to help you manage your components outside of your app, which is what you described, like managing that design system, that component system separately. And yeah, my friend Tom described it a bit as Legos. You kind of have your component and then you put them together, and this way the designer can work on the specific component, and the front-end team can work on these without necessarily having to wait on the back-end team to have the whole app ready. So I find that really interesting, and there's a lot of tools popping up, I think, tailored to that component-driven approach. Like there's this, I know Airbnb has been putting out like things to kind of bridge React and Sketch.
Right.
And I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be like become a mainstream way of building apps, but I feel like it could be, and especially with React's like big push for components as a concept, as opposed to templates or pages. I think this is a really cool approach.
Yeah. So I'd say we have a very similar approach. Yeah, that it's each of our components is just like living on its own, and so our designers are actually fairly technical, so they are like really interested in being able to like dig into the code and just make edits themselves in these components. So it's something that's possible. We just like give them access to that specific repo. I wouldn't say we had anything specific to like manage the design system. It was mostly homegrown, and it's interesting because it's nice. And it makes things almost easier because it was built from the ground up. So you can just like have everything running on its own. And I think actually it became a little bit of a problem for us just because, as I was saying, like when you have the components like finally placed into an application, it may cause problems. So I think what would have been helpful for us would have been to have had like a base application and had the components living inside of it just to like test those user flows and being able to make sure that components can work in several places. But even if we had that, I guess you couldn't necessarily ensure that it would work everywhere because all of our applications are so different within the company.
So actually, I think I'm just going to bring in Michael
cool.
right now, and you can stick around, but I think it'd be cool because he's kind of trying to solve that problem with Storybook. So again, let me locate him in the list of users. And by the way, Martin, if you have any questions, feel free to also pitch in. Okay. So Michael should join us in a little while. I don't know if Martin is still.
I'm here. You don't see my video.
Oh yeah, you are.
No, I've been hiding away so people could see your lovely faces. I'm wondering. So now that you're changed to the React stack, how do you manage your code? Like, is it all on one big repository that you have everything these days, or do you split it up in npm modules, or at Eventbrite, do you use an internal npm or something like that?
So we actually, for a short time, we were using Reggie, and I think we still have our style guide, just kind of in a private registry at this point. Eventbrite Design System also lives on its own in its own repo, but other than that, on the front end, there isn't too much. We also have like one repo for our documentation, and then we actually, there are a couple of applications that are open source as well. So we have like a Bright Charts application, which is kind of our implementation of D3. And that's kind of on its own. And I'm trying to think. Also, our linting rules, we've open sourced those as well. So.
A lot of companies have started to publish their linting rules. I feel like 2016-17 has been the years of linting.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're all
I think it's good advertising, right?
Yes, it is. We're kind of doing group work.
So actually, while we were waiting on Michael, he said his browser is not WebRTC compatible somehow. I will take another question. One option I just realized missing from the survey is training, education, and communities resources. Yeah, that's a good idea. We could have that. I think the hard part is there's just so many of them. Like when it comes to front-end libraries, there's a lot, but it's easy to know what the main ones are. When it comes to books, for example, like how do you decide which ones to feature? How do you even find a list of all JavaScript books? So I would love to have more data on how people learn JavaScript. I think that would be super useful, but I'm not sure how to actually collect that data yet. But definitely, like each edition will try to get better and yeah, add more aspects of JavaScript. So okay, let's see how I can invite Michael. In the meantime, yeah, another question I had for you, Jen, is about build tools, because you, like I said, you wrote the analysis last year. So has anything changed for you this year?
So I was looking at the survey results, and it was kind of interesting to me. I think it makes a huge difference because you guys got close to like or more than twice as many respondents this year. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So a few things. I was like, oh, some of my predictions were correct. So Webpack, people are very happy with Webpack. I think it's about 70% of respondents said that they've used Webpack and would use it again, which is like a huge percentage, especially compared with other tools. The other thing I had said last year was that Grunt is, maybe getting less popular, and Gulp is becoming the more popular task runner. So 50% of respondents, about 50% of respondents said that they have used Grunt and would not use it again. And then on the flip side, they said about Gulp that they've used it and would use it again. So I thought that was interesting. Another data point that I thought was interesting as well was that Rollup was the second most mentioned other tool last year. But then more than 50% of respondents this year had never heard of Rollup. So I think that's kind of the difference between the number of respondents, but I thought it was just like an interesting data point, I guess, with the popularity of Webpack. And then lastly, Yarn wasn't even mentioned at all, I don't think, in the survey. And suddenly this year, it's become the most popular in the other category by a factor of 10 or more compared to all of the other ones mentioned.
Yeah. So, okay, so we finally have Michael live with us. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. And Jenny, I don't know if you have time, but you can stick around. And if you have any questions about Storybook, I'm gonna let you ask a couple questions to lighten my work, maybe. But for now, Michael, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Sasha, Martin, and Jen. Good to meet you guys. And I guess I don't know if I have 15 minutes worth of stuff to share, but I'll go pretty quickly. I have a background in machine learning, and so actually I'm more of a Python guy, but over the past few years, I've been going really deep into JavaScript, all up and down the stack, and recently took over maintenance of a library called Storybook, which maybe some of you have heard of. Jen, you should check it out. This is basically a nice way of managing all the states of your components, both for testing, for documentation, for live development, independent of the rest of your app. It's a pretty popular library. It has almost 17,000 stars on GitHub, and it's being used by Airbnb and Slack and Lyft and Squarespace and IBM and Atlassian and a whole ton of other people. I think in that space, it's the closest thing there is to a standard, although it's a pretty rapidly evolving space. So there's a lot of other tools out there. And this is something that I've been using since it was started. And recently, it was originally run by a company, and then they sort of opened it up to the community. And so a few of us stepped up to maintain it. There's about 300 some odd contributors from every continent except Antarctica, and about 500,000 downloads on NPM each month, which is a vanity metric, but is directionally interesting. And so for me, the year in JavaScript really was about learning how to maintain a pretty big popular repo and deal with lots of pull requests, lots of issues, and lots of community involvement. So if I go back to the beginning of the year, it's the first time I've ever done like a retrospective of a year from a development standpoint. So it's pretty interesting. And I did a lot of back-end work at the beginning of the year. I was building a financial service that was talking to about 20 other services. And so that involved a lot of asynchronous communication. And so from a JavaScript standpoint, my kind of highlight of the first part of the year, one was about rewriting a bunch of promise code using async and await. And it just was like one of these things where you didn't know you were missing it until you found it. I would never go back, and that was really satisfying. And then kind of at a higher level, I was using the Apollo library for doing all the backend kind of GraphQL management. And so I think most people here are probably familiar with that, but the gist of it being that when you get a request, it sort of collects the data that it needs to fulfill the request potentially asynchronously from as many sources as it wants. And that was also just kind of a breeze where you have this service that's actually pretty damn complicated, but Apollo stack for that. So that was kind of the beginning of the year. The middle of the year was kind of ramping up on Storybook and figuring out how to kind of maintain it in a fairly scalable way. So we moved Storybook to a mono repo, so learning
so it seems like Michael got disconnected. Yeah, okay. Well, while we wait, so one question I have for him actually about storybooks. Oh, I wonder do I have to invite him again? Maybe. Okay. Okay, he's connecting. So yeah, I wonder if Storybook users do they mostly like, because the way I've used Storybook is kind of I build my app first, and then I'll put my components in Storybook as a way of having them available for testing. But I haven't yet done the component-driven development thing, like Jen was talking about. So I wonder if most Storybook users like are there yet, or if they have kind of this approach where they just use it like as an addition to their main development workflow. So, okay, I have to invite Michael again. Sorry about all the admin stuff.
And I think it's an interesting point. Like many people, when they code, it takes a lot of time for them to understand or feel the test first kind of way to code, where you write your test first and then use it, use the library later in production. And I think the same thing is with Storybook, where when you write your components first and then use them, might be useful, but on the other hand, the imagination of how to use them and what components you have is a bit harder to grasp. So similar like test first, maybe component first might be hard concept that not always works. And when it works, it's really fun. But until you get there, it might be a hard journey. Yeah, okay. So the question was component first development in Storybook. Is that common or uncommon?
So I think there's a number of different ways to use Storybook. A lot of people are just basically taking libraries that they're building and putting those libraries into Storybook, maybe as a way to document the libraries. I've actually done completely the opposite, where I have an app and I actually build out the entire flow of the app in Storybook, not just as like in screens. And so you can imagine like a flip card where you can go through screen to screen, but it's just HTML and CSS basically. And then so that's kind of your presentation layer, and then you hook up all your container layer on top of that to actually make it function. And that's like a pretty extreme sort of component first way of developing. But I don't know the actual breakdown yet. All this stuff is pretty recent, so I don't know how much it's been adopted. I know people are using it, but I don't necessarily know in what order.
And are there any, well, like what's coming for Storybook? Can you share some things on the roadmap?
Yeah, so we're just getting, so Storybook, which was originally for React and React Native. And so even though those sound pretty similar, the guts of how to do that is fairly different. In 3.2 in June, we added support for Vue, and Microsoft is using the Vue implementation as far as I know. And then in 3.3, which is coming out hopefully before Christmas, we're adding support for Angular. Somebody did support for Polymer. I don't know if anybody uses Polymer, but but we're going to support it.
Lots of people in Portugal,
oh, yeah.
I think.
Nice. And so yeah, it's, I think right now there's kind of a bit about like cross framework-ism in Storybook, and just trying to make it really easy to support any framework that you want. So Storybook also has a lot of add-ons for documentation, add-ons for testing, add-ons for what else? Like accessibility, internationalization, and lots of this type of stuff. And so in the most recent 3.3, we're going to have kind of a feature similar to what you have in Chrome for like testing different device sizes. And so you can basically test your components in different phone and desktop and so on. That was contributed by a guy, Josh Callender at Lyft. And then we also have kind of another add-on for showing jest results in Storybook, so that if you have kind of a combination of your components, which you get automatic snapshot testing for free when you do stuff in Storybook. But if you also have unit tests, you can sort of see the unit tests coming up in your browser window. So you can kind of have a single console for viewing all your test results as you modify. So that's what's on 3.3. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. I'm basically like, there's tons of contributors and people are just always building new features and throwing them in. And so actually a lot of the problem is just kind of make that everything works and that you know, it all kind of is tight to release, and that's what I consider my job to be, is reviewing everything.
Yeah, I think a lot of open source project maintainers are hearing this right now and they're like being super jealous.
I just inherited it. Go, come help me maintain it. There's plenty of work to do in this. But the other the other things that are on the roadmap are about configuring the UI. So you can imagine you have this component that you're looking at. You have like a list of all your components, and then you have some various plugins that show you documentation, maybe allow you to edit the property of the components. And so right now that layout is not very configurable. And so we're going to do a pretty big release where we make the whole UI configurable. So you can sort of set it up as you like. Think like how Atom has all these different frames. But yeah, that's probably enough about Storybook. I encourage everybody to check it out.
Yeah,
I have a plug for it at the end, because actually we're looking for Angular testers, and I have a link. I'll paste the link for kind of how to test Angular. So if you're building Angular projects and you want to try out Storybook and help us out by maybe filing some bugs, it's in alpha right now, and
awesome.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, I will have more about Angular later in the stream, actually.
Excellent.
But for now, so I'm going to invite Marcy in. But before that, we actually have another question about build tools. So Jen, I thought maybe you could take that one if you still have time. So the question is, we're using Gulp for our build script. Webpack came up pretty fast. Is it worth it for us to consider switching? Why?
I feel like, so I'm a little bit of a naysayer when it comes to new tools, I should say. So I think in general, like if you have a tool that's working well for you, I would just continue using it. And that's just my general opinion. The way I see new tools is like, if it's popular though, it can be helpful. And like Webpack's documentation is pretty incredible. And the community just continues to grow. So, I mean, that could be a good reason to use it. I think these are like pretty general assessments though of build tools.
Cool. So, okay. Jen, okay. Sorry, I'm going to have to kick you out because apparently we only have four
All right,
seats.
no problem.
So, thanks so much for tuning in. Maybe if you stick around and if there's another question about build tools or anything else that you want to take, just leave a message in the chat and you can come back. But for now, okay, let's welcome Marcy. So again, I have to find her. Where is she?
I will definitely try Storybook.
And by the way, the tool we're using is Crowdcast, so I'm struggling a little bit because I didn't quite prepare enough, but it really is a great tool. Like, it makes it super easy to hold Hangouts or streams like this with multiple people. You can charge for them. You can set up custom landing pages. You can really do a lot. So I really recommend it. Great support, and they're always adding new features. So I'm gonna ask them to add some search for people to invite. That would be helpful. But yeah, I especially like that you can have the audience ask questions and then vote for the question they want answered most. So actually, you guys, you can do that right now. You can go ask questions and then vote so that we can know which one to prioritize. Anything else? Well, here's a general question. Is not using a framework a good option? So maybe we can each give our take on that. I think it's not a good option because, as people say, if you're not using a framework, you're still using a framework. It's just a framework with only one user, you. So, you know, I think using frameworks is not so much about the framework itself is more about having a pre-existing set of guidelines that other people will be familiar with as well. So, you know, if you really know what you're doing, if you have a really specific use case, sure, go ahead. But generally, I think using a framework should be the default. Okay, so
Hello.
Marcy is here.
Yeah,
Hey, thanks for joining.
Wow. Best setup today.
Yeah, you make all of us look pretty unprofessional with your fancy microphone.
It sounds so much better than the little earbuds. I was stubborn for a while, and then I'm like, wait, I have this thing on my desk. It's thanks to Egghead for making me look all professional.
Oh, that's right. They do send you. This is not sponsored by Egghead, but I do know that they send you like a free mic if you record
They
videos
do.
for it, so that's pretty cool.
Pretty sweet deal. So yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to talk about some JavaScript today. I use JavaScript every day at work, so it's definitely my tool of choice.
So, well, who are you?
Well, I am
and what do
Marcy
you do?
Sutton. I am a senior front-end engineer at DQ Systems, which is an accessibility company. And I build software to help developers fix websites and applications for accessibility. So things like browser extensions, Selenium WebDriver tools, and other APIs for JavaScript testing, and really focused around accessibility and making it easier to debug. So that's my specialty. I've worked on the Angular team before, so got lots of experience working on frameworks. And I think my move towards frameworks was because I saw an opportunity to really impact accessibility at a higher level than working on, say, one website or application at a time. I wanted to go work on tools. And it just so happens that JavaScript is a really helpful tool for accessibility. So yeah, that's my thing.
Oh, that's a great point. Like, going back to that question about not using a framework, if you don't use a framework, you'll have to basically do all that accessibility work yourself. And usually that's something that's not super highly prioritized. But if you do use a framework, maybe the framework can do part of the job for you, right?
Well,
can,
that's a long story. I mean, it depends on the framework. It frankly isn't always that great. So it's sort of a false sense of safety if you assume that the framework is handling it for you. You still have to do some due diligence to make sure. And part of the reason is that frameworks can't guess what's the right thing to do. And a good example would be handling focus and focus management in client-rendered apps and JavaScript apps. From the framework level, we can't really guess what the intent is. So I've actually written tools where I tried to guess and it made things worse. So we still have some responsibility as developers to actually understand accessibility. I think that's part of the job. But hopefully, you find tools that do make it easier for you and don't get in your way. And I think there's lots of tools out there today, things like linters, and I work on the Axe Core library, which is an accessibility API. And the ideas with those is to help you avoid writing that boilerplate in your own tests, because it is helpful to get a little push. You don't have to be an expert. But yeah, don't rely on that false sense of security that a framework is necessarily going to do it the right way. Yeah, I have lots to say about that.
Are there, I guess there's still differences between frameworks? Like, are there frameworks that do it better than others, or that get something
Yeah,
right?
there are. I think we were making a lot of headway with Angular 1, and there was like little modules and tools kind of built around that, like the ng-aria module, but that was not continued with the newer versions of Angular. And while it's maybe not getting in your way in the same ways that it was before ng-aria and Angular 1, I think they haven't really kept that, at least from the end user consuming Angular when you're in that position. I don't think that they've done as much as I would hope for with the newer versions of Angular. But I think the Material 2 team is doing a great job on their components, so those are good for the most part. The React group is, like, everyone working on that is really inclusive and has been approving documentation and things to help developers understand accessibility. I think Ember's got a great track record with accessibility as well, so you've definitely got some options. and it can be done. It's just you don't want to assume that the framework is going to do it all for you, because it won't, sadly. Looks like we lost Michael.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually gonna ask him if Storybooks has anything to say about helping you test accessibility, because I think there could be some crossover there. I don't know if you use
haven't
Storybooks,
used it, but
actually.
I think there might be an Xcore plugin to it, so you could pull in the stuff that I'm working on. I work on sort of like the core of this API, and then it can be consumed in a bunch of different places. You could pull it in your own tests, or you could pull in something like Lighthouse from the Chrome team that uses Xcore as well. And I think there is a Storybook version. So yeah, you can sort of pick which tools work for you, and then try and just get some test coverage and practices that really help users, because that's the goal. It's like the tools are kind of irrelevant, if your user, it's all about their experience, really, in my opinion. So I am sort of with Jen, right before she left, she was saying that it's all about like picking a tool that works for you and not necessarily staying up to date with the most current things. If something, as I like to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, really.
But I think the trouble is knowing when it's broken, or how do you know if it's broken?
I think there's quite a jump often to say things are broken when they aren't necessarily. Like if you look at any JavaScript weekly newsletter, or just like the wheels that are getting reinvented every year, and there's that joke that like every 6 hours there's a new JavaScript framework or whatever. So it is sort of I don't know, you want to be pragmatic and stay on top of things, but you don't need to like jump the second something new comes out necessarily.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the goals of the survey, actually. It's, well, one way to look at it is like, oh, there's so many options, so many technologies I haven't heard of. I need to learn everything. But like the questions are designed in a way that hopefully the results highlight the technologies that kind of have more staying power, maybe. And that's why we ask, like, well, would you use it again? So it's not just about highlighting the latest trend, latest popular thing on top of Hacker News, but really highlighting those tools that are reliable. You can, use them for the next, 5, 6, 10 years, maybe not 10 years in the JavaScript world, but let's say 5.
Yeah, that's a tough call. I mean, you want to stay up to date, especially if you're using open source, just because things get stale. I mean, it's been difficult watching Angular 1 kind of get left behind, even though it's used very widely in production at banks, governments, like all over the place. It's definitely still being used. So it's good to keep, I don't know, make stable software that people can continue to use. But yeah, at some point it does kind of die off. So we have to weigh all of those concerns. But I think still, if a tool is working for you, then keep using it, is my opinion.
Well, actually, that kind of, like, let me know if I'm off the mark here, but I figure the organizations that care most about accessibility are often governments, big companies, have lots of a very diverse customer base, and they can't adopt the latest framework of the day, right? They move kind of slower. So yeah, I wonder if that's kind of a tension between like, well, we want to, if you adopt the latest thing, the accessibility story might not be as mature as staying on previous technologies.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, people can't switch that quickly. I mean, even getting new browsers approved is hard for some organizations. So yeah, there's all of those concerns that you have to weigh. And yeah, it's a difficult situation when you're a developer of a framework or a tool to want to maintain stuff forever. But yeah, you really have to keep your users in mind, and some people can't update that quickly. I live that every day, trying to maintain some old software. So I think back to 2014 when Angular 1 was declared dead, and here we are 3 years later, and there's still banks and lots of organizations using that. So it's an interesting balance that you have to play, and I think we can't leave people behind is what I would hope. Even with all these shiny new things, we still have to maintain some of the stuff from a few years ago.
Very funny. Living in Japan, I to use tools that were built anno 2000 or 99. Those were definitely not built with common frameworks. They're like, pixel fonts and 640 pixel screens, table layouts. So I think maintenance in different countries can actually be quite a bit longer than 4 years. So I'd expect Angular to reach well over 20, Angular 1 to be used in production in well over 15 years. That being said, I would have a question, like, how do you think modern frameworks fare in terms of accessibility? Do they make it easier or more common for people to think or consider accessibility, or is it like they tend to forget about it and focus on other things?
I think the latest frameworks are doing a lot better job of not getting in your way. I remember a time with Angular 1 when adding ARIA attributes to directives, like they would either have errors or conflicts where they'd get removed and stuff. And so we had to do some extra work to make that experience easier. And that's where ng-aria came from. I think these days frameworks are doing less of getting in your way, but there's still some valuable like basics that we have to teach people regardless of the framework. So that's why I switched from working on a specific framework to working on tooling and education to try and teach these fundamentals that are going to be true no matter what framework you're using, if it's Ember or React. Looks like Cassandra is having trouble joining. Hopefully my network connection is fine.
Yeah,
okay,
you're
cool.
coming through fine. I can see Cassandra as well.
Cool.
Oh.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I think we just have too many time zones here.
Cool. Yeah, I think regardless of the tool, there's some fundamentals like focus management is a big one. So I've been talking about that lately using React, but you could swap it out for your favorite framework, and it's really the same mechanics. So maybe I'll follow this up with, I just had an article posted a couple hours ago on writing automated tests for accessibility. And that's sort of a framework agnostic approach. Because that way you can like spread the awareness around to your teammates and try to bake this stuff into your code base. And you can even reuse tests from project to project, which is cool.
Yeah, if you have any article or project or anything to plug, feel free to post them in the chat room. Maybe later I can also collect like all the resources mentioned today and write a blog post or something.
Cool.
So yeah, thanks a ton for joining. Maybe you can stick around a little bit longer. But let's switch to Cassandra for now. So, well, thanks for joining. I think the reason I wanted to have you on today is, so far we've talked a lot about front-end JavaScript, like the browser. We've been very focused on like one aspect of the language, but you actually do different things, not just components and displaying forms and that kind of stuff, but you work with Node, you work with IoT stuff, serverless. So yeah, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself, and then maybe you can tell us more about all that.
Yeah, no problem. So as you mentioned, I'm Cassandra. I work as a developer relations engineer for IOPipe, and we do AWS Lambda monitoring, so visibility and metrics for AWS Lambda functions. So I do a lot of serverless work. I also am an electrical engineering student, and at night I am known as the node botanist because I put lots of node on lots of robots. I work a lot with the Johnny 5 library, and I do a lot of work with the Tesla group and the Tesla 2. So yeah, those are my specialties.
So you mentioned serverless. I've seen recently like Amazon come out with some new libraries. Like, I'm not clear entirely what they are, but like they're building more and more frameworks to help you connect to Lambda. And I know one of them uses Apollo behind the scenes, which I'm familiar with. So I don't know if you know anything about
so
that.
they just at reInvent launched the essentially the App Store for serverless. So it's basically an interface in which you can import other serverless functions into your serverless application. So common use situations for a serverless function, things like that. You can basically just hit clone, and it'll clone that serverless function over to your application. And so it's a really good ease of use tool. If you're getting started in serverless, to be able to take a skeleton app and go from there, as opposed to before, where really the best way to go about it was to use the third-party tool, the serverless framework, either from the CLI or using the web interface on AWS.
So like, let's say I'm a typical front-end developer, like myself, I use React. On the back end, I might use Meteor or Node or my own framework. But what's the case for using serverless and kind of switching to this new way of dealing with the back end stuff?
When you think of serverless, instead of thinking of a server as a node, as a node component, you think of just the function. So these are just single node functions running in the cloud. So there's very little use of frameworks like Express, Koa, the routing frameworks, because usually you expose an AWS Lambda through AWS API gateway, so you don't have to do any of the routing. So a lot of the framework usage goes away in serverless, but we do see a lot of use basically as a secondary to a web server. So a web server might point at a serverless function, or some people have built entire APIs on serverless. But if you're a front-end developer, serverless is mostly avoiding having a large infrastructure on the back end and just being able to write node, hit the button, and have it go.
Yeah, this does sound appealing. There's also some there's traditionally been backend as a service things like Firebase. Now there's like graphical, but typically they're always a bit limited in what they let you do, like in terms of logic that you can run on their servers. So
with AWS Lambda,
I can definitely see
yeah, you just write regular node code. Unfortunately, the newest JavaScript node engine that they released is 6.3. They have not upgraded to 8 yet. Yeah, as someone mentioned in chat, they are much cheaper for certain situations than EC2 instances, because the difference being, when you run a serverless function, you only pay for the time that it's running, unlike, well, just like an EC2 server, but Lambda takes care of spinning up and spinning down your Lambda function as necessary. So it can be more cost effective. We actually at IOPipe just launched a tool. If you go to the URL servers.lol, LOL, there's a questionnaire you can fill out to see if your application would benefit from serverless. But it is just like any other tool in any other architecture. There are applications out there that would benefit from it, both from a cost perspective and from a stability perspective. And then there are some applications that might not, especially applications that experience large, very flatline traffic. So that's one of the things we ask right away is your traffic spiky, or is it predictable, et cetera. So there's lots of different ways to see if serverless works for you, and servers.lol is one of the more concise ways to go about it, at least that I found so far.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know about that site. I will definitely check it out and do the questionnaire for myself. We have a question actually. How fast are the AWS Lambda responses? If set up properly, is it just like having Express as a server?
That really depends. So there are a lot of factors in place. Of course, if your Lambda is running in a region that's far away from where you actually make the response, or actually make the request, the response can take a while. But the number one thing that can really make a response take a while from Lambda is what's called a cold start. So a cold start is when AWS has to spin up a new container for your function to run it. And so those responses can take a lot longer than your average response time. So if you need a constant response quickly as possible and you don't get traffic very often, that may not be the best use case. But if you have constant but spiky traffic in that sense, like if you have spikes regularly, it doesn't spin the Lambda container back down for a set amount of time. So it won't cold start necessarily every time you call it, unless there's a long delay in between calls. So, but other than that, it's about as responsive as any other AWS service.
And like, is there a big learning curve for someone who's never, like me, who's never used serverless, or is it comparable to like going from Express to another backend framework?
It's if you know Node, it's adding a few extra lines of code to your Node application. So to get started on a function, the best way to go about it that I've found is using the serverless framework. Using their CLI tool, you can say I want to name a function hello, and you use the CLI and it'll set up all the folders and files for you. And then in the main index file, it'll say module.exports equals function context callback, and the context is the context in which it was called, so you can get a hold of the request, things like that. And you call callback when you're done, and that's it. And then you write your Node code, and then you say serverless deploy, and you're up on AWS. So it's a very, very low learning curve. If you know Node, you can do serverless.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it was kind of a mission on our part in this year's survey, but next year we'll definitely have a category for.
Well, it's such a new field that I'm not terribly surprised. So basically, serverless as a field has really only existed for like the last 18 months. So the explosion in popularity has really only been in the year 2017. So I'm really not terribly surprised, especially because there's not a lot of choice. Mostly it's what provider you use for your serverless functions, and that's pretty much it on choice. There are very limited third-party tool choices. There are very limited framework choices. It's mostly just serverless framework and a couple other small competitors that are starting to make their way up there. But yeah, so it'll definitely be something to watch in 2018.
Yeah, another difficulty is a lot of these new tools, you're not sure which category to file them in, like mentally or in the survey. So it's harder to explain them because you can't just say, oh, it's a tool to do X or Y, and have people understand right away.
It's not front end, it's not back end, it's its own category, even though it technically it's like a subset of back end, but it's a specialized subset kind of thing. It's tricky.
But definitely super interesting. You also mentioned IoT and bots, and can you talk a little bit more about that?
I joke that 2017 was the year of the shrinking JavaScript engine. Samsung came out with IoT.js and JerryScript, which is a JavaScript engine that can run in under 32 kilobytes of RAM, which even the smallest chips are, a lot of them are not 32. That's not a power of 2. 48 then would be probably closest. Either way, the smallest microprocessors can run this just JavaScript interpreter. And so basically you can write JavaScript for small microcontrollers and have it run. Esperino has also been seeing a lot of work and a lot of popularity growth. It is also a very small JavaScript engine. And then Ducktape is also an engine that is extremely small and can run JavaScript on even tiny microcontrollers. So for instance, in my cart behind me, I have at least 10 ESP8266 chips. They're about the size of a postage stamp, and they cost about $3 in bulk. And through Esperino, I can have them all running regular JavaScript. It's not Node per se, but it is JavaScript. And so it's the year of the shrinking JavaScript engine, and therefore a huge year for JavaScript on IoT.
Yeah, this is so cool. But just from talking with you for 10 minutes, I already have like 3 more categories to add to our survey for next year.
Most people use IoT and JS for a hobby, so I don't see it affecting the industry within the next year. 5 years down the road, probably, because of Samsung's putting their weight behind it with IoT.js. But at least for the next year or two, I still see it as being mostly a hobby, putting IoT or putting JavaScript. Now, managing IoT devices with JavaScript is something that will be big in 2018. AWS launched Greengrass. There's Microsoft's IoT platform, the Azure IoT platform. So writing JavaScript infrastructure to manage IoT devices is definitely something that will be growing in 2018.
I'm just looking at Marcy's message in the chat room. Yeah, IoT has huge implications
for accessibility and security. It's got really good implications for accessibility because yes, a lot of accessible devices. I'm actually building a peripheral for gaming for a friend of mine who can't move his index finger very well. So using a regular keyboard doesn't work very well for him. And so I'm writing in JavaScript a keyboard peripheral that'll allow him to play games without having to strain his index finger. But on the other side, the security is so loose. Wow. The DNS attack, the DDoS attack on DNS core servers that happened about, I think, 5 months ago, that took just about everybody down, was actually committed using ESP8266 malware. And these chips are in millions and millions, if not billions, of IoT devices. And so for the ability, the security hole that was in ESP8266 is the worst part is a lot of companies did not do over-the-air updating of their ESP62 based devices. And so it's almost impossible to patch the devices that are already out there with this exploit. And so IoT does pose major security risks in the future. And that's something we're going to kind of have to slow down the innovating on cool stuff we can build and kind of say, okay, now how do we keep this secure and how do we make this so that won't happen again? So.
Yeah, I think it sounds like for everybody's sake, it's best that I keep my code away from any IoT devices for now.
I mean, for fun, it's really not a problem. And if you keep things on your local area network, the chances are low unless someone gets physical access. But yeah, developing an IoT product right now is really tough with security concerns. So.
Cool. Thank you so much. So now we have Mark joining us.
I can't stay. So thank you so much for having me. I have to go eat dinner. So y'all have a lovely evening. Thank you so much for inviting me. So and hope you have a great night.
This was awesome. Okay.
Hi there.
So hey, Mark. Thanks for joining. I'm really glad to have you on because you're like the React Bible in my mind. Like, I feel if there's something to know about React, you probably know it.
That might be pushing things a little bit too far, but if I don't know it, I can maybe point you at where you could find out.
Yeah, I'm saying this because you wrote the React Redux links repo. Let me share it with people real quick.
Yeah, I'm still getting traffic on that site from your state-of-the-art JS in 2016 post, I think.
Oh, yeah. So this is basically just a huge list of content on how to learn React, including one of my own posts, but tons of resources. I think a complaint that people have about React is that it's not really centralized, like Vue or Angular might have been. So I think this kind of list of resources can come in super handy for people.
And something I've seen mentioned a few times online is that if you look at like Django or Rails or something, there is a one official way to do things, and there's books or guides that people have put together that offer a coherent, structured approach to this is the official way to build an app, and here's all the different topics that you need to know. And you're right, one of the characteristics of the React ecosystem is that there's so many different ways to do things, and there's very few people doing whatever topic in exactly the same way. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Part of it is as the saying goes, that React is just the view layer. Another is that Facebook uses React differently than many other people in the community. And so the React team has been very, very deliberate in not trying to say, this is the blessed way to handle styles, handle state management, handle routing. And so the great thing about React is that you can pick exactly the pieces you want. The bad news about React is you're going to need to pick exactly the pieces you want. So what I've tried to do with my list is at least assemble in one place the best information that I can find on all these different topics. And so it's supposed to be both a place where someone who wants to learn the React ecosystem can go and find tutorials and articles that will get them started, but also a place where they can go to learn more in-depth topics as well. So I'll freely admit that the list has actually kind of maybe grown out of control just a little bit. I'm spending so much time adding new articles and links to it that I can't like keep up with maybe gardening out older things as well. I see video. I'm good. I see you. I don't know about if anyone else can see me.
Okay. No, never mind. Keep going. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I can expect maintaining the list, especially because things change so fast. So if there's a guide on React Router 3 and then number 4 comes out, you have to, you know, update stuff and change the links. So yeah, like, what do you see as, I mean, although this Hangout, this stream is about JavaScript in general, let's just focus on React for now. And what do you see as a trend in the React ecosystem for, well, 2017? And are there any trends that you anticipate for next year?
By far the biggest thing that's going to happen is the work that the React team is doing on asynchronous rendering. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, up through React 15, React did its entire rendering process basically in one giant step. And if you had a whole lot of work to be done, that could effectively block the JavaScript main thread. And so with React 16, they did a very large rewrite of the internals of React, which was codenamed React Fiber, but they kept the external API exactly the same. They added a couple of new methods. They took the chance to finally deprecate a few older capabilities and move them out of the main package, but the core React API and concepts are still exactly the same. And so with this new implementation, they, at the moment, have kept the behavior basically the same for compatibility purposes. The goal was that if your code could run on React 15.5 with no warnings at all, then you should be able to just upgrade to React 16, change the value in your package JSON, and it should just work. That is also assuming that the rest of the libraries you depend on had been upgraded to be compatible with React 16 as well. But now that React 16 is out, they have been doing a lot of research on what it means to do asynchronous rendering. And to be honest, they don't fully understand exactly what that's going to mean themselves, but they have some very, very smart minds, in particular, Sebastian Markbaj and Andrew Clark, who have been digging into that and trying to figure out what it's going to mean for the internals of React, what it's going to mean for React's API, and what it's going to mean for all the other libraries in the ecosystem. If you've been paying any attention to Andrew Clark's Twitter stream over the last couple months, he's been dropping hints saying that this is kind of a big deal and it's going to affect all the libraries in the ecosystem one way or another. And in particular, if you look at the state management libraries like React Redux and MobX, the way they signal that they need to do updates right now is probably going to have to change once these asynchronous rendering updates start rolling out.
Wow. On the one hand, I'm super excited. On the other hand, I'm super scared. I have to change my Redux code, but actually I shouldn't, because the React and Redux team have done a really good job of maintaining API compatibility, like you said, even when things do change behind the scenes.
And especially with React Redux, that's one of the reasons why the Connect package exists. So a couple other aspects that go along with this. The React team has been warning really for the last couple of years that React's context API it's deficient. It works, but it has a lot of weaknesses, and someday it's going to change. Well, someday may be the next minor version of React. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, the React team published a new repository containing requests for comments, basically submitted proposals for changing React's API and React's behavior. And the very first proposal they submitted was from Andrew Clark with a proposed new version of the context API. And so the React Redux library uses context internally to make the store instance available to all the deeply nested connected components. And that will have to change down the road once this new context API comes out. But if all goes well, your application won't have to change at all, because we'll make the changes internally, put out a new version of React Redux, probably React Redux version 6 that's compatible with, a minimum of React 16.3 or 4 or whatever the version is. And you bump your versions, and hopefully your code won't have to change at all.
Well, that's the dream, I guess.
I would have some questions.
Shoot.
Sure.
About unrelated topic called StateOfJS results. Do you think the React? It seems like React is winning the game. Like if you look at the stats, it seems like Angular 2 hasn't even catched up yet, and acceptance is so high, particularly if you look at the survey results. So, are you aware that you're awesome, and how do you want to improve those awesomeness for the next year?
Well, it's less about me. I mean, it's the React team that's doing all that stuff. But
are the React people, the React fraction?
Mm-hmm. I didn't go through the survey results in complete depth, but I did look at a couple pages in particular, and I sort of kind of question how far the survey spread. I know Satya's got some background in the React community. I know a bunch of React related people, including myself, were retweeting and encouraging people to take the survey. But I'm kind of curious how far it actually spread into the Angular community or the Ember community. So there may be a little bit of bias in the results just from which people actually saw the survey and actually got around to taking it. And it's also possible that maybe Angular and Ember are more heavily embedded in large corporations, and maybe those developers are a little more of the classic 9-to-5 developer who they do their work, but maybe they're not really involved in the larger community. Just tossing out possible explanations for some of the disparity in the results there.
So basically, you're saying Angular and Ember are not as cool and hip as React?
That may also be. I don't know. You can take that however you want. But I do think that React has really struck a chord with a lot of the JavaScript community in general. If you look at each of the major frameworks, they've basically adopted some form of components at this point. And while they're each taking different approaches, there are a lot of similarities in terms of architectures and data flow at this point. And I don't claim to be any kind of Angular or Ember Vue expert. I've just read bits and pieces here and there, but clearly there's a lot of cross inspiration and ideas flowing back and forth between the different frameworks. which is also really cool in and of itself, because you've got all these articles saying, you know, Angular, Ember, React, Vue, the deathmatch part 5. And it's like, the developers really aren't actually fighting. They're sharing information and saying, yeah, this is cool.
So can you stick around a little?
Sure.
I'm going to invite Kyle, our next guest, in. But I want to ask you two some questions about React. Okay, well, there's a question for you first. Mark, are you using public class fields? I found that I often don't need a constructor with that. If no, bind in constructor or arrow function in render. That's kind of a very like React-centric in the weeds question, but maybe
it's interesting because there was a Twitter thread the other day from Dr. Axel Rauschmeyer, who's a very, very big JavaScript expert, and he was commenting that he wasn't fond of the proposed class properties syntax, and there were several other people chiming in and agreeing. And meanwhile, those of us from the React community are like, this is pretty much the best thing ever. So yes, the class properties syntax is currently a stage 3 proposal. And the idea is that instead of having to explicitly say this dot some class method equals this dot some class method dot bind this in a constructor, you can, in the body of the class itself, say some class method equals arrow function, and it will automatically be bound to the instance when the class is instantiated. And to me, the syntax is much nicer. I know there's been some people who have pointed out that there's a little more memory usage because you're recreating the function for every component instance instead of delegating to the prototype. But to me, the fact that it solves the problem of passing around class methods as callbacks and not having to worry what this means, and not having to write a constructor unless you're doing some copying of props to state, means that the syntax is a pure win. And so we're using it internally in our own application, and I think it's a great piece of technology.
Awesome. So, hey, Kyle, can you hear us? Can we hear you?
Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
So I'm super happy to have you on.
Yeah.
Because you're the creator of Gatsby, which is the static site generator for React that we are using to power StateOfJS.com.
Amazing website.
Thanks. And Gatsby has actually been like having some pretty major news in the last couple months, I think. So I think it's super appropriate to have you on today.
Yeah.
So I'll let you just introduce yourself first.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, I feel like I'm very much the minority here because you three all have amazing beards and I'm not clean shaven. So, yeah. So I'm creator of Gatsby. Gatsby's 2.5 years old or so. It's getting close into 3. I guess early mid 2013. It kind of hit its 3-year mark. Yeah, and it's a static site generator for React. So it makes it really easy to kind of build traditional. So React, of course, came into the like web application space. So you have some sort of interactive thing in your website. Of course, Facebook originally, just had like parts of their website that they added like interactive stuff with React. But from the get-go, is kind of the idea that you could use it for, take over your whole application with React. Because from the get-go, it had the ability to render to a string. So you could do something on the server and then rehydrate it, or render out to HTML on the server and then rehydrate that in the client. Yeah, and so I saw that and started playing with React, kind of fairly early on. And I've had a lot of experience in the past doing kind of traditional CMS stuff. So with Drupal mostly back in kind of mid-late 2000s. And then I worked at Pantheon, which is a kind of Drupal originally, and then WordPress hosting company. It's a startup in San Francisco. And so anyway, so
I have a lot of background in like CMS type stuff, and so once I started using React and like realizing that it could do websites, it wasn't just a front end JavaScript framework, but it could really do the whole the whole shebang. It felt very natural to kind of like combine the two, and so that you could have all the React goodness for all types of web stuff, not just web apps, but kind of traditional websites as well. And anyways, yeah, so been working on Gatsby for about 2.5 years and full time for almost 1.5 years now, since kind of mid 2016. It's just super fun. Been a great journey. Well, it's really should be one thing, but I went from Vue to V1. Basically the stage of earlier this year in July, and seen a lot of pickup since then. The big thing that version added was kind of a plugin system, and part of the plugin system also was a kind of like a data layer that we call it, kind of like the integrates GraphQL and plugins, so that you can write a plugin which pulls data from basically anywhere that's accessible over the internet, and then easily expose that to your components while you're developing. So you can say, oh, I have this data in WordPress, and now I can like pull it in via a GraphQL query into this page, and then do React stuff. So like map over the array of data, and then print out, like saying you're doing like a list of posts or something. You can write a query and loop over that, and very quickly make an index page from data in your WordPress instance. And it combines it all with the static build, so that the resulting website is still a static site, and can deploy it to a CDN. It's super fast and so forth. So the idea is kind of like combined all the nice parts about the React development experience with while still being able to meet kind of all the needs that you have for kind of a CMS content heavy website type thing. And yeah, it seems from the reception that a lot of people really enjoy the combo, and it's just like a very fun and productive environment to build things with.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, like the official React site now uses Gatsby, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was pretty fun to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's kind of like getting endorsed in a way.
Yeah. Well, I don't actually know if it's a bigger endorsement than StateOfJS using it, but I mean, maybe the two. I mean, they're fairly equal. I feel kind of the broader. Yeah. Anyways. It's to me, I think I saw this on Twitter a while ago, that it was like, if you see people making like really crappy things with your tool, that you're like wildly successful. So it's nice to see. It's nice to see like professional engineers, who are world class, doing great things with Gatsby. But it's almost more fulfilling to see people are like, I'm learning React, I'm learning programming, and they're able to put up websites that actually, like, I won't say they're amazing, but they still look good and work well, and they find that Gatsby is like a really nice environment to kind of do stuff in. So I feel that like a tool that can like stretch from beginners to world-class engineers is doing pretty well.
Yeah, as a Gatsby user myself, I completely agree. A while back, I wrote a post. I don't remember the title, but it was basically use React for everything.
Yeah.
And it was kind of trolling a little bit, but I wanted to address the common advice that you have to use the right tool for the right job.
Right.
And I think that sounds good, but when you're a beginner,
React.
You don't necessarily have the experience to pick the right tool, and maybe you only know one tool, maybe you only have a hammer. So yeah, I think React and something like Gatsby are really nice, because you can use React for a web app, you can use React Native, you can use React for a static site using Gatsby.
Yeah.
And so by having this this hammer or whatever it is, it's kind of or maybe like it's a Swiss Army knife, right? It's one thing you can use for a lot of different purposes. So I really like Gatsby.
Yeah, I think of React as just a better building block for building UI stuff. I mean, HTML, CSS, and JS is nice, but they're really low level. And the component, as exemplified by React, is just a much nicer kind of base building block for any UI thing. And yeah, and so it works super well for web apps, but also happens to work super well for websites. Like a website is just a simple web app at the end of the day. And the same idea of like, okay, I have this like, I'm presenting information in kind of a tree-ish form. How do I decompose this into, reusable pieces that I can like, think about and work on, compose together in a nice way. Or why not use React for everything? Like you're saying, like websites, web apps, native, VR. There's underwater exploration.
So
I don't know where it stops.
Yeah, I have a couple. Oh, sorry, I have a couple quick questions from the audience about Gatsby, and then I want to go back to Mark and yourself and ask about CSS and CSS in JS. So first, about Gatsby, what do you think about Phenomic, which is, I guess, a Gatsby competitor?
Yeah, I only say nice thing about competitors, so I think they're doing a great job. I don't know. I can't really speak directly to it because I've not used it, I guess, directly. But yeah, it looks like there's a lot of people done, are happy users of it, and I've seen a lot of sites built with it. So I think the big differentiator with Gatsby is that we're really focused on not being just a static site generator. So static site generators are kind of pigeonholed as like this developer-friendly tool that builds great sites, but basically has like this niche of you want to have like a markdown-driven site, run primarily by developers. But the thing is, most websites need an actual CMS with a GUI, that's like friendly to non-technical people, and that's really the problem that I guess Gatsby is trying to go after, is like kind of like replace. So something you might use like WordPress or Drupal for now, you could actually legitimately use Gatsby for. And so that's been kind of mine and the community's focus is building out these source plugins to connect to all these different like sources of data. So I think we're up to something like 25, 30 different source plugins for, Markdown, of course, is still 100% supported and like widely used, but there is WordPress source plugin, there's Drupal plugins, there's like all these like headless CMSs that are coming out. It's like Contentful, Graph CMS, Dado CMS, Prismic, and a bunch more. So you also like Trello, Firebase, Google Spreadsheets. It's just kind of interesting. Like once you think about it, it's like, oh, you can just like have data stored somewhere and then connect it.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I think it kind of goes back to the serverless idea we were talking about earlier with Cassandra. Like a backend doesn't have to be like a server sitting somewhere. Like it can be functions. It can be Google Docs. It can be a lot of things.
Yeah.
So our most highly voted question is about CSS.
Okay.
And it's, what's the approach on styling? Do you use a CSS and JS solution? What are the pitfalls for live projects like yours? So I want to go back to Mark first.
This is a topic I'm actually really weak on. I know just enough CSS to be dangerous, and so my team works on a pair of internal geospatial visualization tools. One of them is basically written in Backbone. We're slowly trying to migrate it to React and Redux, but there's going to be a lot of Backbone code in there for a long time. The other is an app that I started myself a couple of years ago, which is actually how I got into React and Redux in the first place. The Backbone app is still using plain CSS files everywhere. In fact, at one point, it was a plain CSS file with literally every line of CSS in the entire application in one file. That was not cool. And then the other application is using semantic UI. So CSS is not my strong point. I have no design skills whatsoever. I am happy to use something else that someone else has made look good.
So I'll answer for myself then. I've used style components on a few projects. I really like it, but I don't know if it's because it's inherently like a bit more complex or it's just new, but for me, it's still easier to just default to Sass and SCSS. So that's what we are using for StateOfJS. But there were a few places where we were like, oh, it'd be nice to have style components, but basically, we were short on time. We were already many months.
The cry of developers
everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we went back to the safe choice. But I think CSS and JS is really interesting. I think I've always thought that CSS had some good ideas, but a lot of bad ideas, a lot of things that didn't make sense, that were too complex. And it's gotten a lot better recently with Flexbox, CSS Grid, and all that. But I definitely think there's like the ceiling on how much you can improve CSS, I think, is very, very high compared to where we are now.
Yeah.
Cal, I don't know what your take on this is.
Oh, I have lots of takes. So I got in React into like kind of early 2014 when I started working on a new project at a startup. Well, I guess the startup was new and the product was new, so everything was new. Anyway, so I was like, boom, React. And I'd been doing, before that, for several years, doing Sass. And I don't recall like loving Sass, but I definitely liked it a lot more than like plain CSS. So anyways, and so when I jumped into React, I was using Sass still. But I guess like once you really start doing a lot of stuff with React, it's just like, and you kind of see, like I was saying earlier, that the component is the really the base of your whole thing. Like the component is the source of truth for every part of your application. And like you're decomposing the application into these components and then combining them together in like flexible ways per the needs of your project. Anyways, it just sort of like, it was weird because like back then there was no CSS and JS. There's inline styles and class names. And even though everyone was saying, still says that like, oh, inline styles is bad, like I just found myself putting more and more of my styles in like the inline, in inline styles. Because it was just so convenient to, I'm building a component. It's so convenient just to add the inline styles there, and I could see, everything. And then like it was like really easy to delete, styles if I didn't need them anymore, and tweak them. And with hot reloading, of course, it's just like really fast to just edit directly in, the component and then see it hot reload into the browser. And so I just started moving more and more of my styles into the component, even while sort of like, oh, I feel guilty because like this is wrong or something. But after a while, I was like, wait a second, maybe this feels too good to be wrong. Anyway, so I was just like, screw it. I'm just going full on inline styles. And then did that for like the next year and a half and was just like incredibly happy with it. And I totally believe that inline styles does have like, it falls apart at some point, like performance-wise. But in my sort of somewhat complicated Sass app, I never saw any performance problem. Like everything was like lightning quick. And I had the same feel like once I started using GraphQL, because the same thing with GraphQL, it again adds another kind of like, it moves more of the source of truth into your component. So now the actual data requirements are specified there, alongside everything else. And whenever you need to make a change, it's like everything's self-contained within that component. And it's very easy to just kind of like move on, whatever. But anyways, and so there's like Radium and Aphrodite, and there's a few other kind of early CSS and JS ones, and none of them really made me happy. And so the first one that I really fell in love with, and I still is my preference, is Glamour by Sunopai. And why I love that is it's basically the same, inline styles experience, where you're just writing JavaScript. And it's just JavaScript all the time for everything. So the Glamour is that same sort of thing because it gives you like the CSS prop that you can just put your styles right as a prop to the component. But then it also gives you support for like full CSS, including like media queries and animations and all that jazz. And it also has like a really slick kind of CSS extraction, so it can like pull out stuff and with Gatsby, if you're using Gatsby and Glamour, it'll actually, so for each page, it'll extract the CSS for that page and then put it in the head. So it's basically inline critical CSS automatically, which is a really
sorry, I'm gonna cut you off because this is a really vast topic. Maybe we should do the state of CSS survey or something.
Yeah. That's your next project.
Yeah.
You can have a bot. Do both kind of in parallel each year.
Yeah. That could be a good idea, actually.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we have Chris joining us now.
Hi.
So hey, thanks for joining. Chris is the founder of Scotch.io, which is a great learning resource. Lots of tutorials, lots of really good content. So also, I feel maybe you can help us like step out of the React bubble a little bit.
Yeah. It's funny because I was looking at
the last half hour has been super React centric.
I was looking at the survey. Hello. I was looking at the survey, and because I haven't really done too much React myself this year, I've been more on the Angular side and the Vue side of things. So it's kind of fun to see all the how the survey laid out with everyone, loving React, and that's everything I hear from developers too. So it's great, but yeah, I'm happy to talk Angular.
Yeah, I mean, Vue is actually something I'm really curious about too, because, okay, I'll come clean. I only use React. I don't have a ton of experience with other libraries, but from doing the survey, it seems like Vue is the other library that has a really high satisfaction ratio among developers. So for me, the Vue and React are kind of the two main contenders. I mean, maybe not in terms of market share, but in terms of potential. So I'm interested to learn about Vue more.
Yeah,
well.
It's funny. I have a little bit of insight on as far as site traffic goes, because of how, I was looking at our Scotch's site traffic, and by far Vue is the framework library that has grown year over year compared to Angular and React. And I think that's just by its nature, because it's kind of the newer framework. I do see a lot of people interested in it, and I think that's what the survey showed, right?
Yeah, and to me, it seems there's kind of a migration maybe from Angular to Vue. Is that
Yeah,
true,
I know you
think,
definitely see that, because I mean the similarities with how the directives are, where you just attach things to HTML elements, is very similar to the way Angular JS did it. So I don't know. I think that's right. A lot of people are kind of seeing what's up with Vue from the Angular side, especially if, I don't know, I think that a lot of people kind of look at Angular v2 Angular, and they kind of see the TypeScript part of it, and then they kind of see the other things that are added on, which I think is a barrier to entry compared to something like React or Vue. But once you jump in, I think give it a chance, right? And just see what it does.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something I've experienced myself, and I think Cal can probably relate to, is sometimes you maintain an open source project and you want to improve it. And so maybe you add a GraphQL integration, for example, but then it turns out a lot of your audience doesn't know GraphQL, so they're kind of turned off. And I wonder if the same thing happened with TypeScript and Angular. Like the Angular team were probably only seeing the positive side of adding TypeScript, but for their audience, maybe there was a bit of confusion and higher learning curve.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point with the GraphQL edition, because I don't know. I'm a big fan of like convention over configuration kind of thing. Jumping on the Angular train, but I do think that it was something that, and this is something we try to push on Scotch, right? Like if you have a project, kind of try to build it in Vue, Angular, and React, and see which you personally like better. I think that's a good approach. So
like what other technologies do you cover? Do you have any other insights in trends or even backend trends?
Well,
maybe?
Node is doing really well. I mean, it just is Node. I think I've seen a big uptick in a Node framework, Adonis. Which is kind of really, really simple syntax. I really like it a lot. And yeah, I don't know. I should probably look up some more stuff. But Vue got the big uptick this year is my thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me go to the survey results. So where is it? Yeah, Vue. You can see it has really big proportion of users who have heard of you and would like to learn it. So, I mean, that's ideal for you, right? Because those people are all going to come to Scotch.io looking for learning material. And, these users, you can, so the way I look at it, if the ratio here, the purple ratio between people who would not use it again and would use it again, if it's favorable, probably means that all the people who are going to try it are going to stick with it, and you'll get a much larger dark purple block here next year. By comparison, let's say Polymer or Amber, you can see they don't have such a good ratio. It's kind of 50-50. So you can suppose that people who do learn Amber might, like, maybe half of them will not stick with it. I'm completely, speculating here, and not to pick on Amber, but that's kind of the way I look at it.
I think that's fair. And one thing that I found interesting in the list is Angular has a pretty big section of I've heard of it and I'm not interested. And it does have another big section for I've heard it and would like to learn it. But I wanted to see how that correlated to the TypeScript side of things. So you go look at the TypeScript thing, and there's a pretty big section of people that are very happy with it, that have tried it, and then a very big section of people that have heard of it and would like to try it. So I thought that those would match closer, the TypeScript and the Angular 2 kind of bars, which is interesting.
TypeScript is interesting, yeah, because last year it was kind of 50-50 between people who wanted to learn it and didn't want to learn it. This year, I feel it's more favorable. So I feel like TypeScript maybe, like last year, in my mind at least, it was kind of split between TypeScript and Flow. I wasn't sure which one was not the best, but the most mainstream one, which one was going to stick around. But I think things are shifting more and more towards TypeScript. And yeah, my outside impression of TypeScript this year is much more that it's a stable and mainstream technology compared to before.
Yeah, and I think Google made it one of their official internal languages. It was allowed on projects now. So I think that was a big push. I think the Angular team did a really big push for TypeScript, and that helped a lot. And I don't know, after working with it, I really like it myself. Yeah.
Cool. Any other insights from either Scott or the survey?
I mean, those were my two big things. Is basically the Vue. Vue is really up and coming, I would say.
Yeah, and maybe next year we can have people from the Vue team or more Vue users on. That'd be really cool.
So next year too, we need add Gatsby to the survey too. That was.
Well, actually, you bring up a really good point, because Gatsby is like a React-specific tool, and I wasn't sure if I should feature those. So style components, Gatsby, Glamour. I didn't want to bias the survey towards React even more.
That makes sense.
So I tried to keep it to a library agnostic, framework agnostic tools. So maybe we need the state of React third survey to add.
You can launch an empire, state of X, and then
true.
Yeah.
And then once you have enough surveys, you do state of surveys, state of to ask.
State of the state of surveys.
All the time.
Yeah, it never will stop.
You have been talking about those, but
sorry.
So this question is to regarding studying Japanese JavaScript. It's almost the same. It's almost the same. Same easy. So do you think, what are the things that people are studying this year? Are they studying Angular? Are they rushing to learn build tools? I myself tried to dabble in GraphQL, and I do think there are questions on various fronts, in order to get something done, right? In order to have a business, we need to educate ourselves to get used to all those new projects that are available to us. Angular and React are the front-end layer sort of thing. But we had the questions about CMSs, right? So what sort of CMS solution do we want to use? The Gatsby.js question also sort of hinted into the direction, like how do we manage websites as a tool, or do we use serverless? Where is the logic for things? And yeah, I would like to get your input. Like, what do you think people are learning about, and what do you think people should be learning about?
Sure, that's a very good question. It's relevant for me this week. So we